The wind howled through the mountain pass like the cries of dying souls, carrying with it the scent of snow and something far more sinister. Amy Reed pressed her back against the rough bark of a towering pine, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air as she listened to the approaching hoofbeats. Her threadbare shawl offered no protection against the biting cold, and her bare feet, cut and bleeding from the rocky terrain, had long since gone numb. The men were getting closer. "Find her!" The voice of her stepfather, Anthony Martin, cut through the night like a blade. "She can't have gone far on foot." Amy's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered around the tree trunk. Torchlight flickered between the branches, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her desperation. She had been running for 3 days now, surviving on melted snow and the few berries she could find, but her strength was failing. The transaction that had brought her to this moment played over and over in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. 3 chickens. That's all she had been worth to the man who had raised her after her mother's death. 3 scrawny chickens traded to Alexander Jimenez, a cruel rancher known for working his hands to death and treating women even worse. The memory of standing in her stepfather's yard, watching the exchange like she was nothing more than livestock, still burned in her chest. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Amy's blood turned to ice. The torchlight was getting brighter, the voices louder, and her hiding spot wouldn't protect her much longer. She had spotted smoke rising from a valley below earlier that day. A cabin, isolated and well hidden among the trees. She had been too afraid to approach then, but now desperation made the decision for her. The choice between the unknown dangers of that distant cabin and the certain cruelty waiting in Anthony's hands was no choice at all. Amy took a deep breath, gathered what little strength remained in her trembling legs, and began to move. She crept through the underbrush like a ghost, using every skill her late mother had taught her about moving silently through the forest. The descent into the valley was treacherous in the darkness. More than once, Amy nearly lost her footing on the loose rocks and steep inclines, but somehow she managed to keep moving. As she drew closer to the valley floor, the scent of wood smoke grew stronger, and she could make out the warm glow of firelight through the trees. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney. A horse stood in a small corral nearby, a magnificent black stallion that looked well-fed and cared for. She was still debating whether to approach when the cabin door opened and a man stepped onto the porch. Amy's breath caught in her throat as she got her first clear look at him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the firelight and a beard that spoke of months in the wilderness. The man stood perfectly still for a long moment, his head tilted as if listening. Then, without warning, he turned and looked directly at the spot where Amy was hiding. "I know you're there," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Been watching you make your way down the mountain for the better part of an hour." Amy pressed herself deeper into the shadows, but the man continued speaking as if he could see her perfectly clearly. "Whoever's chasing you is still up on the ridge," he said, settling onto the porch steps. "But they'll figure out your trail soon enough. Question is, what do you plan to do about it?" The casual indifference in his tone stung, but Amy recognized the truth in his words. She was out of options, and this stranger represented her only chance of survival. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped out of the shadows and into the firelight. The man looked up, and Amy saw his expression shift slightly as he took in her bedraggled appearance. Her dress was torn and muddy, her hair hung in tangled knots around her shoulders, and her feet left small bloodstains on the wooden porch as she approached. "Well," he said after a moment, "you look like you've had better days." Amy tried to speak, but her throat was too dry and raw. She managed only a hoarse whisper. "Please, they're going to take me back." The man studied her for another long moment, then set down his knife and wood. "Take you back where?" "To him, to Alexander Jimenez." The name tasted like poison on her tongue. "My stepfather sold me, like I was nothing more than livestock." Something flickered in the man's eyes at the mention of Jimenez's name. "Sold you for what?" "3 chickens." The words came out as barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of all her humiliation and rage. The man was quiet for so long that Amy began to wonder if he had heard her. Then he stood up and looked toward the ridge, where torchlight still flickered among the trees. Jimenez, you said? There was something new in his voice now, a hardness that hadn't been there before. Amy nodded, not trusting her voice. And your stepfather? What's his name? Anthony Martin. She wrapped her arms around herself. They'll be here soon. I shouldn't have come. No. The word was quiet but absolute. The man turned back to her, and Amy saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. You should come inside, get warm, get some food in you. Amy hesitated. She had learned not to trust the kindness of men, especially when she was vulnerable and alone. I don't have anything to pay you with, she said. The man's mouth quirked up in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Didn't ask you to pay me anything. Asked you to come and say it before you freeze to death on my porch. He turned and walked toward the cabin door, then paused when he realized she wasn't following. Your choice, he said without looking back. But those men will be here within the hour. Amy looked back toward the ridge, where the torchlight seemed to be moving in a more organized pattern now. Taking a deep breath, she followed the stranger into the cabin. The interior was a revelation. Where she had expected rough bachelor quarters, she found a space that spoke of care and attention to detail. The furniture was handmade but skillfully crafted, and the fire burning in the stone hearth filled the room with warmth and light. Books lined one wall, and the smell of cooking food made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. Sit, the man said, indicating a chair near the fire. I'll get you something to eat. Amy sank into the chair gratefully, feeling warmth seep into her frozen limbs for the first time in days. She watched as the man moved around the small kitchen with efficient movements, ladling stew from a pot and cutting thick slices from a loaf of bread. Eat slow, he advised, settling into the chair across from her. Your stomach's probably forgotten what food feels like. Amy tried to follow his advice, but the first taste of the rich, hearty stew broke down what little restraint she had left. She ate with desperate hunger while the man watched with careful attention. How long since you ran? He asked when she finally slowed down. 3 days. Amy wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. I've been hiding during the day, moving at night. The man nodded as if this made perfect sense. Martin's got a reputation as a tracker. Learned it during the war from what I hear. The casual way he spoke about her stepfather surprised Amy. You know him? Know of him. This is a small territory, and word travels. The man took a sip of his stew. Know Jimenez, too. Man's got a reputation for being hard on his workers, especially the women. Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks. Then you know why I ran? I know why any sensible person would run. The man leaned back in his chair. Question is, what do you plan to do now? It was the question Amy had been avoiding, the one that made her chest tight with panic. I don't know, she admitted. I have nowhere to go. No family, no friends, no money or skills. That's not true, the man said quietly. You made it down a mountain in the dark without breaking your neck. You evaded a search party for 3 days with no supplies. You found my cabin when you needed shelter. Those are all skills. Before Amy could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Amy's blood turned to ice as she recognized the rhythm of multiple horses moving at a steady pace. The man was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. He peered through the glass for a moment, then turned back to Amy with an expression that had gone completely cold. 6 men, he said, armed. Your stepfather is leading them. Amy felt the stew turn to lead in her stomach. What do I do? The man studied her for a long moment, then walked to a cabinet and pulled out a rifle, checking the action with practiced efficiency. You stay right where you are, he said. Let me handle this. But they'll take me back, Amy whispered. The man paused and looked at her directly. For the first time since she had met him, his carefully neutral expression cracked, and she saw something fierce and protective flash in his eyes. Nobody's taking you anywhere, he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made Amy believe him. I give you my word on that. The hoofbeats were getting close now, and Amy could hear voices calling out through the night. The man moved to the door and opened it, stepping onto the porch with his rifle held casually but ready. Amy crept to the window, her heart hammering as she watched the torchlight approach the cabin. Anthony Martin rode at the head of the group, his face grim with determination. The men behind him were a rough-looking bunch, the kind of hired hands who asked few questions. Amy recognized two of them from town, but the others were strangers. All of them were armed. "Evening," the man called out as the riders entered the clearing. His voice was perfectly polite, but there was something in his posture that made it clear he was not to be trifled with. Anthony pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet from the porch. His eyes swept over the man, taking in the rifle and his obvious competence. "Name's Anthony Martin," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm looking for my stepdaughter, young woman, about 20, dark hair. She ran off 3 days ago and we've been tracking her. Trail leads right to your door." "That so?" The man's tone remained conversational. "Lot of trails lead past here. It's a natural route through the mountains." "Maybe so," Anthony said, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "But this particular trail ends at your cabin. Now, I don't want any trouble, friend. Just want to collect what is mine and be on my way." The man was quiet for a moment, studying each of the men in turn. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a different quality, harder and more dangerous. "Funny thing about that," he said. "See, I know who you are, Martin, and I know what kind of man you are. Word is you sold that girl to Alexander Jimenez for the price of 3 chickens. Anthony's face darkened. "What I do with my own family is my business. Now I know she's in there. Send her out and we'll be gone." "Can't do that," the man said, and the simple finality in his voice made Amy's breath catch. "See, the way I figure it, anybody desperate enough to run barefoot through the mountains in winter is running from something pretty bad." The tension in the clearing ratcheted up several notches. Amy could see the hired hands shifting in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. Anthony's face had gone completely cold. "You're making a mistake," Anthony said, his voice low and threatening. "That girl is legally mine to dispose of as I see fit. You're harboring stolen property." The man laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "Stolen property? That what you call a human being? That's what the law calls her?" Anthony shot back. "She's my ward until she marries or comes of age, which means I have every right to arrange her future as I see fit. Now send her out, or we'll come in and get her." The man stepped forward, and Amy saw several of the men reach for their guns, but there was something about his presence that made them hesitate. "Here's the thing, Martin," the man said. "I know the law pretty well myself, and I know that selling a ward into what amounts to slavery isn't legal in any territory. Matter of fact, I'd say that makes you the one breaking the law here." "You don't know what you're talking about," Anthony snarled. "Don't I?" The man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made Amy shiver. "See, I used to be a federal marshal, back before I decided I preferred the peace and quiet of mountain living. Still got my commission, matter of fact, which means I've got the authority to arrest you for human trafficking." The silence that followed was deafening. Amy watched as Anthony's face went through a series of expressions, from disbelief to calculation to barely controlled rage. "You're bluffing," Anthony said finally. The man reached into his shirt and pulled out a badge, the metal catching the torchlight. "United States Marshal Jose Rivera," he said formally, "and I'm placing you under arrest." The clearing erupted into chaos. Two of the hired hands immediately wheeled their horses around and fled. The remaining men drew their weapons, but Jose was already moving, diving behind a wooden post as gunfire erupted. Amy pressed herself against the cabin wall as bullets shattered the night air. Through the window, she could see muzzle flashes and hear the thunder of hoofbeats. Jose's rifle cracked twice, and she heard someone cry out in pain. "Burn him out!" Anthony's voice rose above the chaos. "Fire the cabin!" Terror flooded through Amy as she realized what he meant. She looked around desperately for another way out, but the cabin had only one door. More gunshots echoed across the valley, and Amy heard the whistle of bullets passing close to the windows. Jose's rifle answered steadily, and gradually the return fire began to slacken. Amy made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of cowering, she began searching the cabin for anything that could be used as a weapon. She found a second rifle in Jose's bedroom, along with ammunition. Her hands shook as she loaded it, remembering the lessons her father had given her before his death. Amy positioned herself at the back window where she could cover an approach from that direction while Jose held the front. The rifle felt heavy in her hands, but she forced herself to remain calm. A shadow moved among the trees behind the cabin, and Amy's finger tightened on the trigger. One of Anthony's men was trying to circle around, probably carrying the torch that would set the building ablaze. Amy tracked his movement carefully, waiting for a clear shot. When the man stepped into the open, torch held high, Amy squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and the man spun around and fell, the torch flying from his hand to land harmlessly in the dirt. From the front of the cabin, she heard Jose's voice, raised in what might have been approval. "Good shot!" The firefight continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Amy managed to wound another man who tried to approach from her side, while Jose's steady marksmanship kept the main group pinned down. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. Amy heard the sound of horses retreating and Anthony's voice calling out across the clearing. "This isn't over, Rivera. That girl belongs to me, and I'll have her back." "You're welcome to try," Jose called back. "Just remember that I know who you are now." The hoofbeats faded into the distance, and silence settled over the valley once more. Amy remained at her post for several more minutes, rifle ready, until Jose appeared in the doorway behind her. "They're gone," he said quietly. "For now." Amy set down the rifle with shaking hands and turned to face him. In the lamplight, she could see that he had a graze on his left arm where a bullet had passed too close, but otherwise he appeared unharmed. "You really are a federal marshal?" she asked. Jose nodded, settling into a chair with a slight wince. "Retired mostly, but the commission's still valid." He looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You handled yourself well back there. That was good shooting." Amy felt a flush of pride despite everything. "My father taught me before he died." "Well, you haven't lost the skill." Jose reached for a bottle on a nearby shelf and took a long drink. "Question is, what do we do now? Martin's not going to give up." The reality of their situation settled over Amy like a cold blanket. Anthony would be back, probably with more men and better planning, and even if Jose was willing to protect her, she couldn't ask him to spend the rest of his life fighting off her stepfather's attempts to reclaim her. "I should leave," she said quietly. "Find somewhere else to go." Jose looked at her for a long moment. "Where would you go?" He had no answer for that. She had no money, no connections, no skills that would allow her to make a living on her own. "I don't know," she admitted. "What if there was another option?" Jose said slowly. "Something that would keep you safe and give you a future worth having." Amy looked at him suspiciously. "What kind of option?" Jose stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. "Martin sold you to Jimenez for 3 chickens," he said. "Legally speaking, that makes you Jimenez's property until the transaction is completed or voided." Amy felt her heart sink, and "So I do have to go to him." "Not necessarily." Jose turned back to her. "See, property can be bought and sold. And I happen to know that Jimenez is a practical man who values profit above all else." Understanding dawned slowly. "You want to buy me from him?" "I want to make you an offer," Jose said carefully, "a business proposition that would benefit both of us." Amy waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I need a wife," Jose said bluntly. "Not for romance or companionship, but for practical reasons. This territory's getting more settled every year, and a married man with a homestead has more legal standing than a bachelor." Amy stared at him. "A marriage of convenience?" "Exactly. You'd have a home, protection, and a legal status that would put you beyond Martin's reach forever. I'd have a wife on paper and someone to help with the domestic work." It was a logical solution, and Amy had to admit. "What would you pay Jimenez?" Jose smiled. "Well, he paid 3 chickens for you. I was thinking of offering him 30. Despite everything, Amy found herself laughing. 30 chickens? "Good ones," Jose said solemnly. "Prize breeding stock." Amy shook her head, still laughing. "You'd pay 30 chickens for what he bought with 3? "I'd pay 30 chickens for a partner," Jose corrected gently. "Someone who can shoot straight, think under pressure, and isn't afraid to stand and fight when cornered." The laughter died in Amy's throat as she realized he was serious. For the first time in her life, someone was offering to value her not as a burden to be disposed of, but as a person with skills worth respecting. "You barely know me," she said quietly. "I know enough," Jose replied. "I know you're brave and smart. I know you can handle a rifle and keep your head in a fight." Amy looked around the cabin, taking in the books and the careful craftsmanship, the sense of permanence and security. It was more than she had ever dared hope for. "What would be expected of me?" she asked. Jose seemed to consider the question carefully. "Help with the domestic work, cooking, cleaning, mending, maybe help with the garden in spring. Nothing you wouldn't be doing anyway." "And that's all?" Jose met her eyes directly. "That's all. I'm not looking for a romantic relationship, Amy. I'm looking for a partner." Amy felt something loosen in her chest. "No, other expectations?" "None," Jose said firmly. "This would be a business arrangement, nothing more. You'd have your own room, your own space, your own choices." It was more freedom than Amy had ever been offered by any man, but there was still one question that had to be asked. "What if I want to leave someday?" Jose was quiet for a long moment. "Then you leave, Derm," he said finally. "I won't try to stop you or track you down. That's not the kind of man I am." Amy studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, but she found only honesty and a kind of weary pragmatism. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Jose walked back to the window and looked out at the valley. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he said quietly, "and I know what it's like to need a second chance." There was something in his voice that suggested a story, a past that had driven him to this remote cabin. But Amy didn't press for details. 30 chickens, she said, testing the words. 30 chickens, Jose confirmed. Amy looked around the cabin one more time, taking in the warmth and security it represented. For the first time in days, she felt safe. For the first time in years, she felt valued. "All right," she said, the words coming out stronger than she had expected. "I accept your offer." Jose nodded as if he had expected no other answer. "Good. I'll ride out to Jimenez's place tomorrow and make the arrangements." Amy felt a flutter of nervousness. "What about Anthony?" "Maybe," Jose said, but he didn't sound particularly concerned. "But he'll think twice about it now that he knows I'm a federal marshal. And once you are legally married, he'll have no claim on you whatsoever." The word married sent a strange thrill through Amy. She had never expected to marry, certainly not under these circumstances, but the prospect of legal protection in a secure home was appealing. "When?" she asked. "Soon as I can arrange it. There's a circuit judge who comes through the territory every few weeks." Jose paused, then looked at her with something that might have been concern. "Unless you would rather wait. Take some time to think about it." Amy shook her head. "No, the sooner the better. I want this settled before Anthony has time to cause more trouble." Jose nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. I'll leave first thing in the morning and be back by evening." Amy straightened her shoulders, feeling more confident than she had in weeks. "I think I can handle it." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Amy woke in the small bedroom Jose had given her, feeling more rested than she had in months. Jose was already up and moving around the kitchen when she emerged, and the smell of coffee and bacon made her mouth water. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in years," Amy admitted. "Thank you for everything." Jose shrugged, as if providing sanctuary to desperate fugitives was something he did every day. "Eat up. I want to get an early start." They ate in comfortable silence, and Amy found herself studying her unlikely rescuer in the morning light. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not much past 30, with the kind of weathered competence that came from years of hard living. "Tell me about Jimenez," she said as they finished eating. Jose's expression darkened slightly. "The kind who sees everything in terms of profit and loss. He's not cruel for the sake of cruelty, but he's not particularly concerned with other people's welfare either." "And if he won't?" "Then we'll find another way," Jose said with quiet certainty. "But he will. Jimenez is many things, but he's not stupid. 30 prize chickens are worth more than one reluctant worker." Amy nodded, though she couldn't quite shake her nervousness. So much depended on the greed and practicality of a man she had never met. Jose seemed to sense her concerns. "Look," he said, "I know this whole situation is strange and probably frightening. If you want to change your mind, now's the time to say so. Amy considered his words carefully. She could ask him to take her to the nearest town instead, could try to make her own way in the world. But the truth was, she had no money, no skills that would earn her a living wage, and no connections. And winter was coming fast to the mountains. I don't want to change my mind, she said firmly. I want to do this. Jose studied her face for a moment, then nodded. All right then, I should be back by evening. Keep the rifle handy, and don't open the door for anyone except me. What if Anthony comes back? He won't, Jose said with confidence. Not today anyway. But even if he does, you know how to handle yourself. Amy felt a flush of pride at his matter-of-fact confidence in her abilities. Be careful, she said as he prepared to leave. Jose paused in the doorway, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. I'll be careful, he promised. And Amy, don't worry too much. Everything's going to work out fine. After he left, Amy spent the morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly. The books on the shelves revealed an educated man with interests ranging from philosophy to agriculture. The kitchen was well-stocked with supplies that spoke of careful planning. Everything about the place suggested competence and forethought. She spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing, partly to keep herself busy and partly because she wanted to contribute something to the household that had taken her in. By the time the sun began to set behind the western peaks, the cabin was spotless and a pot of stew was simmering over the fire. Jose returned just as full darkness settled over the valley, his horse moving with the steady gait of an animal that had covered many miles. Amy met him at the door, searching his expression for any sign of how the negotiations had gone. Well, she asked as he unsaddled his horse. Jose's face was unreadable in the lamplight, but there was something in his posture that suggested satisfaction. It's done, he said simply. Jimenez accepted the offer. Amy felt a mixture of relief and apprehension flood through her. Just like that? Just like that. Jose stepped onto the porch and paused to look at her. Turns out 30 prize chickens was more tempting than he could resist. So I'm free? You're free of Jimenez, Jose corrected gently. And as soon as we're married, you'll be free of Martin too. Speaking of which, I talked to the circuit judge while I was in town. He'll be through here day after tomorrow. 2 days. Amy felt her heart rate quicken at the thought. In just 2 days, her entire life would change again. Are you having second thoughts? Jose asked. Amy shook her head. No, it's all happening so fast. Fast is good in this case, Jose said pragmatically. The sooner we make this legal, the sooner you're beyond anyone's reach. They went inside and Jose accepted a bowl of the stew Amy had prepared with quiet appreciation. As they ate, he told her more about his conversation with Jimenez and the arrangements he had made. The judge will be here around noon, he said. Simple ceremony, just the legal requirements. I've arranged for a couple of witnesses from town. Amy nodded. What about after? What happens then? Then you're Amy Rivera, Jose said matter-of-factly, legally married, legally protected, and legally free to make your own choices about your future. The name sounded strange to Amy's ears, but not unpleasant. Amy Rivera. It had a solid, respectable sound. There's something else, Jose said, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small leather pouch. Jimenez gave me this. Said it belonged to you. Amy's breath caught as she recognized the pouch. It had belonged to her mother, containing the few pieces of jewelry and small treasures that were all she had left of her parents. Anthony had taken it when he sold her. How did you get this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Told Jimenez it wasn't part of the original deal, Jose said simply. Amy opened the pouch with trembling fingers, and tears sprang to her eyes as she saw her mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had been worn thin by years of hard work. There was also a small locket with her parents' pictures. Thank you, she whispered, clutching the pouch to her chest. You don't know what this means to me. Jose looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. They're yours, he said gruffly, should never have been taken in the first place. Amy wiped her eyes and looked at the man who had already given her so much. Why are you really doing this, Jose? You could have found a wife anywhere, someone without all the complications I bring. Jose was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and distant. I told you I used to be a federal marshal, he said. What I didn't tell you was why I stopped. Amy waited, sensing that this was important. There was a case, Jose continued. A young woman, not much older than you, being held against her will by a man who claimed she was his ward. Same kind of situation you were in, actually. I tried to help her, tried to use the law to get her free. What happened? Jose's jaw tightened. The law failed her. Technicalities, jurisdictional disputes, corrupt officials. By the time I cut through all the red tape, she was dead. Killed herself rather than face what that man had planned for her. Amy felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. I'm sorry. I quit the Marshal Service the next day, Jose said. Came up here to get away from a world where good people suffer because the system's too broken to protect them. He looked at her directly. When I saw you on my porch last night, I knew I couldn't let it happen again. Understanding dawned slowly. So this isn't really about needing a wife at all. No, Jose admitted. It's about making sure you don't end up like she did. Amy felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. This man was willing to completely upend his life to save someone he barely knew, simply because he couldn't bear to see injustice repeated. What was her name? Amy asked softly. Sarah, Jose said, and the name seemed to hang in the air between them. Sarah Mitchell. She was 19 years old. Amy reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Then we'll do this for her too, to make sure her death meant something. Jose looked down at their joined hands, and Amy saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. Yeah, he said quietly, for her too. The next day passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Jose spent the morning making final arrangements while Amy tried to make herself presentable. The clean clothes Jose had provided were practical, but hardly wedding attire, and she had no way to properly arrange her hair. But as she looked at herself in the small mirror, Amy realized that she didn't look desperate anymore. Her face had filled out slightly from regular meals. Her eyes were clear and alert rather than haunted by fear. And there was something in her posture that suggested confidence rather than defeat. Jose returned from town in the early afternoon with news that everything was arranged. The judge would arrive as scheduled, along with 2 witnesses who had been sworn to discretion. Nervous? Jose asked as they waited for the judge to arrive. Terrified, Amy admitted, but not of the marriage, of everything else. What if Anthony finds out? He can try, Jose said calmly, but marriage law is pretty clear. And federal law trumps territorial law when it comes to human trafficking. Once we're married, you're legally my wife, and he has no claim on you whatsoever. Amy nodded, trying to find comfort in his certainty. And you're sure about this? Jose looked at her with something that might have been amusement. Amy, I've seen you handle a rifle under pressure, watched you make decisions in a crisis, and shared meals with you for 2 days. I know more about your character than most people learn about their spouses in months of courtship. But what if we don't get along? Then we'll figure it out as we go, Jose said pragmatically. Most marriages are built on less foundation than mutual respect and shared goals. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Amy felt her heart begin to race. This was it. Judge Harrison was an elderly man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. His witnesses were a middle-aged couple from town who treated the whole affair with polite discretion. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, focusing on the legal requirements rather than romantic sentiment. Amy found herself repeating vows that spoke of mutual support and legal commitment, promising to honor and respect a man she was still learning to trust. When Jose slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she felt a strange mixture of relief and trepidation. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, Judge Harrison intoned, I now pronounce you husband and wife. And just like that, Amy Reed ceased to exist. In her place stood Amy Rivera, married woman, legal adult, free citizen. It was the most liberating moment of her life. After the judge and witnesses departed, Amy found herself alone with her new husband in the cabin that was now legally her home. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with the significance of what they had just done. Well, Jose said finally, I guess we're married. I guess we are. Amy looked down at the ring on her finger. What happens now? Now we figure out how to live together, Jose said practically. Starting with dinner, I suppose. Amy laughed, surprised by how normal the moment felt. I can cook dinner. It's the least I can do for my husband. The word felt strange on her tongue, but not unpleasant. Jose smiled, the first truly relaxed expression she had seen from him since they met. I'd like that, wife. They worked together in the kitchen, falling into an easy rhythm that suggested they might actually be compatible as domestic partners. Amy found herself relaxing as they talked about practical matters, how to divide household chores, what supplies they would need for winter, how to expand the garden in spring. You know, Amy said as they sat down to eat, this might actually work. I think it will, Jose agreed. We both know what we're getting into, and we both have good reasons for making it work. As if summoned by their moment of optimism, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley once again. But this time, there was only one horse, and it approached at a leisurely pace. Jose was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, but his posture was alert rather than alarmed. Stay inside, he told Amy, moving to the window. Probably just a traveler, but no point taking chances. Amy watched through the glass as a lone rider entered the clearing. Even in the fading light, she could see that this was not one of Anthony's men. The horse was a fine bay mare, and the rider sat with easy confidence. As the figure drew closer, Amy realized with the start that it was a woman. It's all right, Jose called out, setting down his rifle. I know her. The woman dismounted with fluid grace and approached the cabin with a smile that was visible even in the gathering dusk. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothes that spoke of prosperity. Jose Rivera, she called out as she reached the porch. I heard you got married today. Thought I'd come by to meet your bride. Jose opened the door with genuine pleasure. Amy, I'd like you to meet Betty Flores. She runs the general store in town and knows everyone's business within 50 miles. Betty laughed, a warm sound that immediately put Amy at ease. Guilty as charged, and you must be the young lady who's got everyone talking. Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks. People are talking about me? Honey, when a confirmed bachelor like Jose Rivera suddenly gets married to a mysterious young woman, of course people are going to talk. Betty's eyes were kind, but shrewd. Question is, are they talking kindly or otherwise? Jose's expression darkened slightly. What are you hearing, Betty? Nothing too harmful yet, Betty said, accepting the chair Jose offered her. Most folks are just curious, but there are rumors floating around about your stepfather, Amy, and some of the things he's been saying in town. Amy's stomach clenched. What kind of things? Claims you're mentally unstable, that you ran off in a fit of madness and need to be brought back for your own safety. Says Jose here took advantage of a confused young woman. Amy felt the blood drain from her face. It was exactly the kind of manipulation Anthony excelled at. Nobody's believing him, are they? Jose asked. Betty shrugged. Some are, some aren't. People who know you tend to give you the benefit of the doubt, but folks who don't know either of you might be swayed. Amy sank into her chair, feeling the weight of her new problems. He's not going to give up, is he? Doesn't sound like it, Betty said gently. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to force him into the open where everyone can see what he really is. Jose leaned forward. What do you mean? Betty smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. I mean that Anthony Martin has been throwing his weight around town for years, and a lot of people are getting tired of it. If he keeps pushing this story about poor, confused Amy, he's going to have to provide some evidence. Understanding dawned on Amy's face. People will start to wonder why he's so determined to get me back. Exactly. A truly concerned guardian would be relieved to know his ward was safely married and settled. Jose nodded slowly. So we let him hang himself with his own rope. That's one approach, Betty agreed. But there's another option. There's going to be a harvest dance in town next weekend. Big social event, everyone will be there. If you two showed up together, let people see for themselves that Amy is happy and healthy, it would go a long way toward putting the rumors to rest. Amy felt her heart sink. The thought of appearing in public, of being scrutinized and judged by strangers was almost as terrifying as facing Anthony's men. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. You don't have to decide right now, Betty said kindly. But think about it. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. After Betty left, Amy and Jose sat in contemplative silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the mountain wind whispered through the trees outside. She's right, isn't she? Amy said finally. About the dance. It would help if people could see that I'm all right. Jose nodded reluctantly. Probably, but I won't pressure you into it. Amy was beginning to realize that hiding in the cabin wasn't a long-term solution. If she was going to build a new life as Amy Rivera, she would eventually have to face the world as Amy Rivera. What if Anthony shows up at the dance? She asked. Then we deal with it, Jose said simply, together. The week that followed was both peaceful and tense, filled with the ordinary routines of domestic life, shadowed by the knowledge that Anthony was still out there, still plotting. Amy threw herself into learning the rhythms of her new home, mastering Jose's kitchen, familiarizing herself with the homestead, and gradually beginning to feel like she belonged somewhere. Jose was a surprisingly easy man to live with. He was neat without being obsessive, helpful without being controlling, and respectful of her space and privacy in ways that Amy had never experienced before. They fell into comfortable routines, Jose handling the outdoor work while Amy managed the household, both contributing to meals and evening conversations. Amy found herself sharing more about her life before Anthony's cruelty than she had ever told anyone. She spoke of her parents, who had died when she was 16, leaving her vulnerable to her stepfather's machinations. She talked about her dreams of education and independence, dreams that had been crushed under Anthony's control. And gradually she began to speak of new dreams, possibilities she had never dared imagine before. Jose, in turn, shared more of his own history. He had grown up in Texas, the son of a Mexican father and an Irish mother, navigating the complexities of mixed heritage in a territory where such things mattered greatly. His path to becoming a federal marshal had been long and difficult, marked by discrimination and the need to prove himself repeatedly. The law was supposed to be the great equalizer, he told Amy one evening. Didn't matter who your parents were or what you looked like, as long as you could do the job. But it didn't work out that way? Amy asked. Jose's laugh was bitter. It worked sometimes, when I was dealing with clear-cut cases, obvious criminals, but when it came to the more complex cases, the ones where powerful people were involved, he shrugged. That's when I learned that the law is only as good as the people who enforce it. Amy thought about Sarah Mitchell, the young woman whose death had driven Jose to abandon his career. Do you ever regret leaving? Sometimes, Jose admitted. There are still people out there who need help, but I couldn't keep watching good people get crushed by a system that was supposed to protect them. And now? Jose looked at her directly. Now I'm thinking that maybe there are other ways to fight injustice. Smaller ways, more personal ways, but just as important. Amy understood what he meant. By marrying her, by providing her with legal protection and a secure home, Jose was fighting the same battle he had fought as a marshal, just on a more intimate scale. As the week progressed, Amy found herself thinking more about Betty's suggestion regarding the harvest dance. The idea still terrified her, but she was beginning to understand that fear was not a good enough reason to hide from the world indefinitely. I want to go to the dance, she announced on Thursday evening, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Jose looked up from the book he was reading. Are you sure? No, Amy admitted, but I think Betty was right. People need to see that I'm not being held against my will, that I'm happy and healthy. Jose closed his book and gave her his full attention. It won't be easy. There will be questions, stares, probably some gossip. I know, but I can't hide forever. Amy took a deep breath. Besides, I'll have my husband there to protect me. The word husband still felt strange on her tongue, but it was beginning to feel more natural. Jose smiled. All right then, he said. We'll go to the dance. But we do it on our terms. We stay as long as you're comfortable, leave whenever you want to, and if anyone gives you trouble, they'll have to answer to me. Amy felt a rush of gratitude and something else, something warmer that she wasn't quite ready to examine. Thank you. Nothing to thank me for. We're partners now, remember? We look out for each other. The next day, Jose rode into town to make arrangements while Amy spent the day preparing. She had no proper dress for such an occasion, but she did her best with what was available, mending and altering one of her mother's old dresses that had been packed in the precious pouch Jimenez had returned to her. The dress was simple but well made, a deep blue wool that complemented her coloring and fit her reasonably well after some adjustments. She arranged her hair as best she could, pinning it back in a style that was modest but flattering. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not the desperate fugitive who had stumbled onto Jose's porch, but a respectable married woman preparing for a social event. Jose returned from town with news that was both encouraging and concerning. The dance was definitely happening, and most of the community would be there. But Anthony had also been in town, spreading his story about Amy's supposed mental instability. "How are people reacting?" Amy asked. "Mixed," Jose said honestly. "People who know me are skeptical of Martin's claims, but he can be very convincing. And there are always folks who are ready to believe the worst." Amy nodded, having expected as much. "What about the law? Is there any chance he could have me declared incompetent?" "Not without evidence," Jose said firmly. "And once people see you tomorrow night, it'll be pretty clear that you're perfectly capable of making your own decisions." That evening, Amy found herself too nervous to eat much dinner. The thought of facing a room full of strangers, all of whom would be evaluating her and her marriage, made her stomach churn. But underneath the fear was a growing determination. "What if I say something wrong?" she asked Jose. "What if I make things worse?" Jose paused in the doorway of his room and looked back at her. "Amy, you survived 3 days alone in the mountains, evaded a search party, held your own in a gunfight, and made one of the most difficult decisions a person can make when you agreed to marry me. You're not going to be defeated by a bunch of gossips at a country dance." His confidence in her was both reassuring and intimidating. Amy had never thought of herself as particularly brave or capable, but Jose seemed to see qualities in her that she was only beginning to recognize in herself. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "if anyone gives you trouble, just remember that you're an excellent shot with a rifle. That tends to put things in perspective." Amy laughed despite her nervousness. "I don't think I'll be bringing a rifle to the dance." "Probably not," Jose agreed. "But the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle yourself in a crisis, that's something you carry with you everywhere." As Amy lay in bed that night, she thought about Jose's words. She had handled herself in a crisis, multiple crises in fact. She had made difficult decisions and lived with the consequences. She had survived things that might have broken other people. Maybe it was time to stop thinking of herself as a victim and start embracing the strength she had discovered in herself. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start living. The morning of the dance dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Amy woke with a sense of nervous anticipation that was more excitement than fear, and she realized that she was actually looking forward to the evening ahead. She spent the day in careful preparation, bathing in the large tub Jose had thoughtfully provided, arranging her hair with more care than she had taken in years, and finally putting on the blue dress that had belonged to her mother. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who was ready to face the world. Jose had also taken care with his appearance, trading his usual work clothes for a clean shirt, pressed trousers, and a jacket that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame. When Amy saw him waiting for her in the main room, she felt a flutter of something that might have been pride. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm. Amy took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. "Ready!" The community hall was ablaze with light and filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and fiddle music. Amy paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Couples dancing in the center of the room, groups of women chatting near tables laden with food, men gathered around the edges discussing local politics. It was exactly the kind of normal, wholesome social gathering she had dreamed of attending but never been allowed to enjoy. "Breathe," Jose murmured in her ear, his hands steady and reassuring on her back. "You belong here just as much as anyone else." Amy took his advice, drawing in a deep breath and letting it out slowly. She did belong here. She was Amy Rivera now, a married woman with every right to attend community events. The fact that her marriage was unconventional didn't make it any less legitimate. Their entrance caused a noticeable stir. Conversations paused as heads turned in their direction, and Amy felt the weight of dozens of curious gazes. But Jose seemed completely unaffected by the attention, guiding her into the room with easy confidence. Betty Flores was the first to approach them, her face wreathed in smiles as she hurried over to greet the newcomers. "Amy, you look absolutely lovely," she said warmly, taking Amy's hands in hers. "That color is perfect on you. And Jose, don't you clean up nice?" Jose smiled, clearly comfortable with Betty's friendly teasing. "Thank you for the suggestion about coming tonight. I think you were right." "Of course I was right," Betty said with mock indignation. "I'm always right about these things. Now come on, let me introduce you to some people." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions and polite conversations as Betty led them around the room, presenting Amy to various members of the community. Amy was struck by how normal it all felt, how readily most people accepted her as Jose's wife without prying into the circumstances. There were a few awkward moments, of course. Some of the older women asked pointed questions about where Amy had come from and how she had met Jose, clearly fishing for gossip. But Amy had prepared for such inquiries, and she answered with polite vagueness that satisfied curiosity without providing ammunition for rumors. "I was living with my stepfather north of here," she would say. "Jose and I met when I was in need of assistance. He was kind enough to help me, and we discovered we were quite compatible." It was the truth, if not the whole truth, and it seemed to satisfy most questioners. The few who pressed for more details were gently but firmly redirected by Jose. Amy was beginning to relax and actually enjoy herself when she noticed a commotion near the entrance. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the figure striding into the hall with aggressive confidence. Anthony Martin had arrived. He was dressed in his best clothes and wearing the expression of righteous concern that Amy remembered all too well from her childhood. Behind him were two men Amy didn't recognize, but their bearings suggested they were there for more than social purposes. "Jose," Amy whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. "I see him," Jose replied quietly, his body tensing almost imperceptibly. "Stay calm. We knew this might happen." Anthony's eyes swept the room until they found Amy, and his face immediately took on an expression of relief and paternal concern that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know him as well as she did. "Amy," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "Thank God you're all right. I've been so worried about you." The silence that fell over the hall was deafening. Amy felt every eye in the room turn toward her, waiting to see how she would react to this unexpected confrontation. Her first instinct was to flee, to run as she had run before, but Jose's steady presence beside her gave her the strength to stand her ground. "Hello, Anthony," she said, her voice carrying more clearly than she had expected. "I'm fine, as you can see." Anthony began moving toward them, his expression a masterful blend of relief and concern. "Sweetheart, you gave us all such a fright when you disappeared like that. Dr. Williams said episodes like this are common in cases of female hysteria, but we were still terrified something might have happened to you." Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks at the public humiliation Anthony was attempting to inflict, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of manipulation he excelled at, twisting the truth just enough to make himself look like the concerned guardian while painting her as mentally unstable. "I'm not having an episode of anything," Amy said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent hall. "I left because you sold me to Alexander Jimenez like I was livestock. 3 chickens, if I remember correctly." A gasp went up from several of the women in the crowd, and Amy saw shock and disgust flicker across multiple faces. Anthony's expression darkened for just a moment before he managed to reassemble his mask of concerned authority. "Now, Amy, you know that's not what happened," he said in the kind of patronizing tone one might use with a confused child. "I was arranging a marriage for you, as is my right and responsibility as your guardian. Mr. Jimenez is a respectable rancher who is willing to provide you with a home and security." "By purchasing me like a piece of property," Amy shot back, her anger finally overriding her fear. Tell them about the chickens, Anthony. Tell them how you valued your own stepdaughter at exactly 3 chickens. The crowd was beginning to murmur now, and Amy could see that Anthony's story was not being received as sympathetically as he had hoped. The idea of selling a young woman for livestock was shocking even by frontier standards. "You're confused, dear," Anthony said, but there was a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "The fever you had last month must have affected your memory." "I never had a fever," Amy said firmly, "and my memory is perfectly clear. You sold me because you wanted to be rid of me, and 3 chickens was the best offer you could get." Jose stepped forward slightly, not enough to seem threatening, but enough to make his presence felt. "I think that's enough," he said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of authority that made people listen. "Amy is my wife now, legally married and under my protection." Anthony's eyes flicked to Jose, and Amy saw calculation replace the false concern in his expression. "And who are you to interfere in family matters?" "I'm Federal Marshal Jose Rivera," Jose said, and Amy heard several people in the crowd draw in sharp breaths. "And I'm Amy's husband, which means I have both the legal authority and the personal motivation to protect her from anyone who might wish her harm." The revelation that Jose was a federal marshal sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Amy could see people reassessing the situation, realizing that this was not simply a domestic dispute, but a confrontation between legitimate law enforcement and a man whose actions were increasingly looking questionable. Anthony's face went through several expressions as he processed this information. "Marshal or not, you have no right to interfere with the legal guardianship of a ward." "Actually, I do," Jose said calmly. "Marriage supersedes guardianship in all territorial and federal law. Amy is an adult woman who chose to marry me of her own free will. Your guardianship ended the moment she said, 'I do.'" "She's not competent to make such decisions," Anthony protested, his composure finally beginning to crack. "She's mentally unstable, prone to fits of hysteria and irrational behavior. The marriage should be annulled on grounds of incompetence." Amy felt a surge of fury at Anthony's continued attempts to paint her as mentally deficient. But before she could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "That's the biggest load of horse shit I've ever heard." Everyone turned to see an elderly man pushing through the crowd, his weathered face set in lines of disgust and anger. Amy didn't recognize him, but from the way people made room for him and the respectful attention he commanded, it was clear he was someone of importance in the community. "Judge Whitman," Betty whispered to Amy. "He's been the territorial judge for 20 years. Judge Whitman approached the group with the deliberate pace of a man who was accustomed to having his words carry weight. "I've been listening to this conversation, Martin, and I have to say your story doesn't hold water." Anthony's face paled slightly. "Your Honor, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," Judge Whitman interrupted. "You can probably explain how a supposedly mentally unstable young woman managed to evade a search party for 3 days, navigate mountain terrain in the dark, and make rational decisions about her own future. You can probably explain how someone prone to hysteria is standing here having a perfectly coherent conversation with a room full of people." The judge's words were having a visible effect on the crowd. Amy could see heads nodding in agreement and expressions of skepticism directed toward Anthony. "Most of all, Judge Whitman continued, you can probably explain how a concerned guardian's first reaction to discovering his ward is safely married to a federal marshal is to demand her return rather than express relief for her well-being." Anthony opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Whitman held up a hand for silence. "I've heard enough," the judge said firmly. "Mrs. Rivera appears to be in perfect health, both mental and physical. She's clearly capable of making her own decisions, and she's legally married to a man of good standing in the community. Your guardianship is terminated, Mr. Martin, and I suggest you accept that fact gracefully." A cheer went up from several people in the crowd, and Amy felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. It was over. Finally, truly over. But Anthony was not finished. His face had gone red with rage, and Amy could see that he was beyond caring about public opinion or legal niceties. "This is not over," he snarled, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "That girl belongs to me, and I'll have her back one way or another. The threat was unmistakable, and Jose stepped forward with the fluid grace of a predator sensing danger. "Are you threatening my wife, Martin?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Anthony seemed to realize he had gone too far, but his anger was beyond his control now. "I'm stating a fact. She's mine, and I'll take her back when I'm ready." "Over my dead body," Jose said simply. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Amy could see hands drifting toward weapons, could feel the crowd holding its collective breath as they waited to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Then Anthony made a fatal mistake. Instead of backing down or attempting to salvage what remained of his reputation, he let his rage override his judgment completely. "Maybe that can be arranged," he said, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. What happened next unfolded with terrible clarity. Anthony's hand was barely halfway to his weapon when Jose moved, his own gun appearing in his hand with the kind of speed that spoke of years of practice in countless life-or-death situations. The metallic click of the hammer being drawn back echoed through the suddenly silent hall like a death knell. "I wouldn't," Jose said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had faced down dangerous opponents before. "Not unless you want to find out how fast a federal marshal can draw." Anthony froze, his hand hovering over his gun butt, his face a mask of rage and calculation. Amy could see him weighing his options, trying to decide if his pride was worth risking his life. The two men who had accompanied him were also tense, clearly uncertain whether to support their employer or distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a very dangerous situation. "This is a community dance," Judge Whitman said into the silence, his voice carrying the authority of law and common sense. "Not a place for gunfights. I suggest everyone take a step back and remember where they are." For a long moment, nobody moved. Amy held her breath, terrified that Anthony's rage would override his survival instincts and that the evening would end in bloodshed. But gradually she saw reason reassert itself in her stepfather's eyes. His hand moved slowly away from his weapon, though his expression remained murderous. "This isn't over," Anthony said again, but the words lacked the conviction they had carried moments before. He was beginning to realize that his public confrontation had backfired spectacularly, that instead of painting Amy as a confused victim, he had revealed himself as a vindictive and potentially dangerous man. "Yes, it is," Jose said firmly, but he didn't lower his weapon. "Amy is my wife, and she's under federal protection. If you threaten her again, if you come near her again, if you so much as speak her name in public again, I will arrest you for harassment and intimidation. And if you try to harm her, I will kill you." The simple, matter-of-fact way Jose delivered the threat made it all the more chilling. Amy could see that Anthony believed every word, and so did everyone else in the room. "You can't threaten me," Anthony blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not threatening you," Jose replied calmly. "I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions. What you do with that information is up to you." Judge Whitman stepped forward, clearly intent on diffusing the situation before it could escalate further. "Mr. Martin, I think it would be best if you left now. This is a community celebration, and your presence is no longer welcome." Anthony looked around the room, taking in the hostile faces and disapproving expressions that surrounded him. Whatever support he might have hoped to find in the community had evaporated in the face of his public threats and obvious instability. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." He turned and stalked toward the door, his two companions following somewhat reluctantly. As they reached the entrance, Anthony paused and looked back at Amy one final time. "You'll regret this," he said, the words carrying across the silent room like a curse. "Both of you will regret this." Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of shocked and disturbed people. The silence stretched for several long seconds before Judge Whitman cleared his throat. "Well," he said with forced lightness, "that was certainly more excitement than we usually have at these gatherings. I think we could all use some music to settle our nerves." As if released from a spell, the crowd began to move and talk again. The fiddle player struck up a lively tune, couples began to form on the dance floor, and gradually the normal rhythms of the social gathering reasserted themselves. But Amy could see that the confrontation had changed things. People were looking at her differently now, not with curiosity or mild disapproval, but with sympathy and respect. Betty appeared at Amy's elbow, her face flushed with excitement and indignation. Well, I never, the absolute nerve of that man, making such a scene at a community dance. And the things he said about you, Amy, anyone with eyes can see you're perfectly sensible and capable. Other people began to approach, offering words of support and reassurance. Amy found herself surrounded by women who had witnessed Anthony's behavior and were clearly appalled by his treatment of her. For the first time in her life, she felt the warmth of community support, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. "You handled that beautifully, dear," said an elderly woman Amy didn't recognize. "Stood right up to him and didn't let him intimidate you. That takes real courage." "And marrying Marshall Rivera," added another woman with obvious approval. "Smart girl, finding herself a man who can protect her from bullies like that." Jose had holstered his weapon and was now accepting congratulations and handshakes from several of the men in the crowd. Amy could see that his reputation as a federal marshal, combined with his obvious competence in handling Anthony's threats, had elevated his status in the community considerably. "Would you like to dance?" Jose asked, appearing at her side as the music shifted to a slower, more romantic melody. Amy looked at him in surprise. They had never danced together, had barely touched except for the most formal and necessary contacts. But the idea of being held by him, of moving together to the music, was suddenly very appealing. "I'd like that," she said, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. Jose was a surprisingly good dancer, leading her through the steps with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything else. Amy found herself relaxing into his embrace, enjoying the feeling of being protected and cherished in front of the entire community. "Thank you," she murmured as they swayed to the music, "for everything, for protecting me, for standing up to Anthony, for giving me a chance at a real life." Jose looked down at her, and Amy saw something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. "You don't need to thank me, Amy. You're my wife. Protecting you is not just my duty, it's my privilege." The word wife sounded different when he said it now, less like a legal convenience and more like something precious and meaningful. Amy felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the exercise of dancing and everything to do with the man holding her in her arms. As the evening progressed, Amy found herself genuinely enjoying the social gathering. She danced with several other men, chatted with the women, and gradually began to feel like a real member of the community rather than an outsider seeking acceptance. The confrontation with Anthony, terrible as it had been, seemed to have established her legitimacy in a way that mere introductions never could have. But even as she enjoyed herself, Amy remained aware of the undercurrent of tension that Anthony's threats had created. She could see it in the way Jose's eyes constantly scanned the room, in the way several of the men kept glancing toward the door, in the subtle way the community had closed ranks around her and her husband. "He'll be back," she said to Jose during a quiet moment between dances. "Anthony doesn't give up easily, and he hates being humiliated in public." Jose nodded grimly. "I know, but next time we'll be ready for him. And next time he won't have the element of surprise." Amy felt a chill at the certainty in his voice. She had hoped that the public confrontation would end Anthony's pursuit of her, but she was beginning to realize that it might have only made him more determined and more dangerous. "What do we do?" she asked. "We live our lives," Jose said simply. "We don't let him turn us into prisoners in our own home. But we stay alert and we stay prepared." As the evening wound down and couples began to drift toward the door, Amy realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer a frightened refugee hiding in the mountains. She was Amy Rivera, a married woman with a place in the community and people who cared about her welfare. Whatever Anthony might do next, she would not face it alone. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rolled through the moonlit landscape. Amy found herself studying Jose's profile in the silver light, thinking about how much her life had changed in just over a week. She had gained not just safety and security, but something she had never expected: the beginning of genuine affection for the man who had rescued her. "Jose," she said as they approached the cabin, "what you said back there about protecting me being your privilege, did you mean that?" Jose was quiet for so long that Amy began to wonder if he had heard her. Then he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and turned to look at her directly. "Yes," he said simply. "I meant every word." Amy felt her heart begin to race. Even though our marriage is supposed to be just a business arrangement, Jose's smile was soft and a little sad. "Amy, I may have married you for practical reasons, but that doesn't mean I don't care about what happens to you. You're a remarkable woman, and any man would be privileged to have you as his wife, business arrangement or not." The warmth in his voice made Amy feel bold in a way she had never been before. And if it became more than just a business arrangement, if we decided we wanted it to be a real marriage in every sense? Jose's breath caught, and Amy saw something flicker in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "Is that what you want?" Amy took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would change everything between them. "I think it might be, if you're willing to give it a chance." Jose reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "Amy Rivera," he said softly, "I would be honored to have you as my wife in every sense of the word." When he kissed her, it was with the tenderness of a man who understood that she had been hurt and the passion of a man who was beginning to fall in love. Amy melted into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished and desired for the first time in her life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever threats Anthony might pose, Amy knew that she and Jose would face them together. Not as reluctant partners in a marriage of convenience, but as husband and wife in the truest sense of the words. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace to the mountain cabin that Amy had never experienced before. The changing season painted the landscape in brilliant colors, and she found herself falling in love, not just with Jose, but with the life they were building together. Their relationship had shifted gradually from careful politeness to genuine affection to something deeper and more profound. They worked together seamlessly now, anticipating each other's needs with the kind of intuitive understanding that usually took years to develop. Amy discovered that she was not just capable of managing a household, but that she had a talent for it, turning Jose's functional bachelor quarters into a real home filled with warmth and comfort. Jose, in turn, began to share more of himself with her. He told her stories of his childhood in Texas, his struggles to establish himself as a lawman, and his gradual disillusionment with a system that too often failed the people it was supposed to protect. Amy learned that beneath his quiet competence lay a man of deep feeling and strong principles, someone who had chosen isolation not from misanthropy, but from a wounded idealism that was slowly beginning to heal. They had heard nothing from Anthony since the confrontation at the dance, though Jose remained vigilant and Amy never ventured far from the cabin without him. The community had embraced them both wholeheartedly, with neighbors stopping by regularly to check on them and include them in the informal networks of mutual support that made frontier life possible. Amy was beginning to think that perhaps the worst was behind them when Jose returned from a trip to town with news that shattered their peaceful existence. "Anthony's been busy," he said grimly, settling into his chair by the fire. "He's been to the territorial capital, talking to officials, filing complaints." Amy felt her stomach drop. "What kind of complaints?" "He's claiming that I kidnapped you, that the marriage was performed under duress, that you're being held against your will." Jose's jaw tightened. "He's demanding a federal investigation." The words hit Amy like a physical blow. Just when she had begun to feel secure, when she had started to believe that her new life was permanent, Anthony was threatening to tear it all away. "Can he do that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He can try," Jose said, "and unfortunately, he's got enough political connections to make trouble. There's going to be an investigator coming out from Denver, a federal marshal named James Bennett. He'll want to interview both of us, examine the circumstances of our marriage." Amy felt panic rising in her chest. What if he believes Anthony's story? What if he decides the marriage isn't valid? Jose reached for her hands, his touch steady and reassuring. "Then we'll deal with it. But Amy, you need to understand something. You're not the same person who ran barefoot through the mountains 6 weeks ago. You're stronger now, more confident. Anyone who talks to you for 5 minutes will be able to see that you're here by choice, not coercion." Amy wanted to believe him, but the fear was overwhelming. She had built so much on the foundation of their marriage, had invested so much hope and emotion in their life together. The thought of losing it all because of Anthony's vindictive pursuit was almost unbearable. "When is this investigator coming?" she asked. "Next week, probably. I sent word that we'll cooperate fully with any official investigation." Jose squeezed her hands gently. "Amy, I need you to trust me on this. The truth is on our side, and the truth has a way of coming out when it matters." Amy nodded, trying to find comfort in his confidence. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the wind howl through the mountain passes, she couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness was as fragile as autumn leaves, beautiful but destined to be swept away by the first harsh storm. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and preparation. Jose coached Amy on what to expect from the investigation, helping her organize her thoughts and prepare for the kinds of questions a federal marshal would ask. They gathered documentation of their marriage, testimonials from community members who had witnessed their relationship, and evidence of Amy's mental competence and voluntary participation in their union. Marshal James Bennett arrived on a cold Thursday morning, riding a government horse and wearing the kind of official expression that suggested he took his duties very seriously. He was a man in his 40s with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent years in the saddle, and Amy could see immediately that he was cut from the same cloth as Jose, competent, professional, and not easily fooled. "Marshal Rivera," he said, dismounting and offering his hand to Jose. "I'm James Bennett, sent by the Denver office to investigate certain allegations regarding your marriage." Jose shook the offered hand with professional courtesy. "Marshal Bennett, we're prepared to cooperate fully with your investigation." Bennett's eyes moved to Amy, and she felt herself being assessed with thorough attention. But there was no hostility in his gaze, only the careful evaluation of someone trying to determine the truth. "Mrs. Rivera, I presume?" he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Yes, sir," Amy replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'll need to interview both of you separately," Bennett said, turning back to Jose. "Standard procedure in cases like this. Is there somewhere private where we can talk?" Jose nodded toward the cabin. "My wife can wait outside while we talk, then you can interview her privately. Whatever you need to establish the facts." Amy felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of being questioned alone by a federal marshal, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had nothing to hide, and the truth of her situation should be obvious to any objective observer. The interview with Jose lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Amy paced the porch and tried not to imagine what kinds of questions were being asked or how Jose was answering them. When the cabin door finally opened and Jose emerged, his expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away about how the conversation had gone. "Your turn," Bennett said to Amy, his tone professional but not unkind. "This shouldn't take too long." Amy followed the marshal into the cabin, her heart pounding as she settled into the chair across from him. Bennett pulled out a notebook and pencil, then looked at her with the kind of direct attention that suggested he was prepared to listen carefully to whatever she had to say. "Mrs. Rivera," he began, "I need you to tell me, in your own words, how you came to be married to Marshal Rivera. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Amy took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him about her parents' death, about Anthony's cruelty and control, about the sale to Alexander Jimenez that had finally driven her to flee. She described her desperate flight through the mountains, her arrival at Jose's cabin, and the practical arrangement that had evolved into something much deeper and more meaningful. Bennett listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just paying careful attention to her words and demeanor. Amy found herself relaxing as she spoke, realizing that the truth of her story was its own best defense. She was not a victim, being held against her will, but a woman who had found love and security in the most unlikely circumstances. "And you're happy in this marriage?" Bennett asked when she had finished her account. "Very happy," Amy said without hesitation. "Happier than I ever thought possible. No coercion, no threats, no pressure to remain in a situation you don't want." Amy almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "Marshal Bennett, my husband gave me my own room, my own space, my own choices about everything from what to cook for dinner to whether I wanted the marriage to be more than just a legal arrangement. If anything, he's been too respectful of my independence." Bennett made a note, then looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "Too respectful?" Amy felt a heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean," He's never pressured me for anything. He's been a perfect gentleman in every way. And your stepfather's claims that you're mentally unstable? Do I seem mentally unstable to you? Amy asked, meeting his eyes directly. Bennett studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. No, Mrs. Rivera, you don't. You seem like an intelligent, competent woman who made a difficult decision under trying circumstances and has found happiness as a result. Amy felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. Then you don't believe Anthony's accusations? I believe that Anthony Martin is a man who's angry about losing control over someone he considered his property, Bennett said bluntly. And I believe that he's using the federal government to try to get that control back. The marshal closed his notebook and stood up, his expression suggesting that the interview was over. Mrs. Rivera, I've seen enough to satisfy myself that you're here of your own free will and that your marriage is legitimate. I'll be filing a report to that effect with my superiors. Amy felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. Thank you. You don't know what this means to us. Bennett's expression softened slightly. Actually, I think I do. I've been a marshal for 15 years, and I've seen what happens when the system fails people who need protection. It's refreshing to encounter a case where it actually worked the way it's supposed to. After Marshal Bennett left, carrying with him a report that would hopefully put an end to Anthony's harassment once and for all, Amy and Jose found themselves alone in their cabin with a sense of profound relief and renewed hope for their future. The investigation had been nerve-wracking, but it had also served to clarify something important. Their marriage, whatever its unconventional origins, was real and legitimate in every way that mattered. It's over, Amy said, settling into Jose's arms as they sat by the fire that evening. Really over this time. Jose held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. It's over. Bennett's report will carry a lot of weight in Denver, and Anthony doesn't have enough political influence to override the findings of a federal investigation. Amy tilted her head back to look at him. What do you think will happen to Anthony now? Jose's expression was thoughtful. Hopefully, he'll finally accept that he's lost and move on with his life. But even if he doesn't, he won't be able to use official channels to harass us anymore. Amy nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be free of it. For the first time since her parents' death, she could look toward the future without fear, could make plans and dream dreams without wondering if they would be snatched away by forces beyond her control. What do we do now, she asked. With the rest of our lives, I mean. Jose's smile was soft and full of possibilities. Whatever we want. We got a good homestead here, room to expand if we want to. We could raise cattle, grow crops, maybe start a family someday if that's something you'd like. The mention of children sent a warm flutter through Amy's chest. She had never dared to imagine herself as a mother, had never thought she would have the security and stability necessary to raise a family. But now, with Jose's arms around her and their future stretching out bright and promising before them, the idea seemed not just possible but wonderful. I'd like that, she said softly. All of it, the cattle, the crops, the children, a real life with you. Jose's arms tightened around her. Then that's what we'll have. All of it, for as long as we both shall live. As winter settled over the mountains and the snow began to fall in earnest, Amy found herself marveling at the transformation in her life. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened, powerless young woman with no prospects and no hope. Now she was Amy Rivera, beloved wife of a good man, respected member of a caring community, and mistress of her own destiny. The cabin that had once seemed like a temporary refuge had become a true home, filled with the warmth of genuine love and the promise of shared tomorrows. Jose had taught her to read the weather signs and track game, to preserve food for the long winter months, and manage the practical details of frontier life. In return, Amy had brought comfort and companionship to a man who had been alone too long, healing wounds he had carried for years, and helping him remember that there was still goodness and justice in the world. On quiet evenings by the fire, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled deep against the windows, Amy would sometimes think about the girl who had run barefoot through the mountains in desperate flight from a life of servitude and abuse. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, who had found love and respect in the freedom to choose her own path. Anthony Martin had valued her at 3 chickens, had seen her as nothing more than a burden to be disposed of for whatever small profit he could extract. But Jose had seen something different, a partner, a companion, a woman worth 30 chickens and so much more. He had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, had offered her not just protection, but the chance to become the person she was meant to be. As Amy drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the familiar sounds of their mountain home, she reflected on the strange ways that fate could work. What had seemed like the worst moment of her life, standing in Anthony's yard watching herself be sold like livestock, had actually been the beginning of everything good that had followed. Sometimes, Amy thought drowsily, the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in chickens or dollars or any other currency that men used to calculate worth. Sometimes the most precious gifts came disguised as disasters, and the greatest love stories began with the most unlikely meetings. She was worth 30 chickens to the man who loved her, but more importantly, she was worth everything to herself. And that, Amy Rivera knew as she settled into sleep beside her husband, was a treasure beyond all calculation. The mountain wind sang through the pines outside their cabin, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, a sound full of wild beauty and ancient wisdom. And in the warm circle of Jose's arms, Amy smiled and dreamed of the future they would build together, one day at a time, for all the years to come. In the end, she had been traded for 3 chickens and purchased for 30, but she had found something infinitely more valuable than any price could measure. A love that saw her true worth and a life that was entirely her own to live. And that, Amy knew with the certainty that comes from hard-won wisdom, was worth more than all the chickens in the world.